Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. And today I'm joined by my colleagues Amit, Kumar and Anushka Saxena, both of whom are research analysts at the Indo-Pacific Studies program, and both of whom have been closely watching developments over the past week or so, looking at the changes in Indian diplomacy amid three specific events that have taken place. The first of these was the recently concluded Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. The other was Prime Minister Modi's visit to Russia, which coincided with the NATO Summit in Washington, D.C. And there was lots of consternation around that. So what we're going to try and do over the next 30 odd minutes, hopefully, is to try and unpack some of the developments that have taken place while offering some thoughts. We were having a conversation before we started recording, and we realized that lo and behold, we don't have all the answers. So we're going to try and speculate on some things, and we're going to try and see if we can also come up with some ideas as to what's really happening in the world of international diplomacy. So Amit and Anushka, welcome to this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so I'll begin with a general question to the both of you, which is, I've mentioned the three events that we're going to talk about. What are your big takeaways when you look at all three of them together? What are the sort of three or four things that really struck out to you? Amit, let me begin with you.
Yeah, if I have to begin with SCO Summit, took place last week, I would say the biggest takeaway, the signaling that I would gather from India's participation at SCO would be that the Indian dispensation might not be that eager with its membership participation at the SCO now. This is the second year when, last year we held it virtually and did not had the summit in person when India was chairing SCO. And this year, with Modi's absence from the visit, and instead, S. Jaishankar, the foreign minister leading Indian delegation to SCO, seems like India is attaching less and less importance or does not see a lot of utility with that platform. Partly, more so because now with the addition of, the fact that Pakistan is also there in the summit, and China also is a primary rival to India, and the expansion of the platform and the focus that is primarily, despite the focus being on terrorism, the regional focus is largely Central Asia, and India's concerns are largely missing from that area. So that is one big takeaway for me from the SCO summit. From India-Russia, that summit that took place, and the Modi's visit to Russia, I think the biggest takeaway for me was that India was able to get assurances from the Russians with respect to the release of Indians who are fighting the Russian war against the Ukrainians. I think that was the biggest takeaway. The signaling could have been this visit calls into questions two key important signalings. The first being Modi choosing Russia as its for his first state visit after his re-election and swearing in ceremony. Second being it coinciding with the NATO summit. And again, we can of course discuss this ahead in the podcast, but these are the takeaways for me from Modi's visit to Russia. NATO, the biggest takeaway, I think, is that the NATO members have yet not committed to getting Ukraine as a member of NATO, partly because that will also create much bigger obligations on the NATO members with respect to the Russia-Ukraine war. But the fact that they have signaled and committed 40 billion euros now, I think, to Ukraine's war effort is significant. And the fact that Ukraine would be, for the first time, would be receiving F-16s now, that it could use against the Ukrainians. The only problem for the Ukrainians still remains is that there's a limit on how they can use this US, the NATO aid or the NATO, the fighter jets that they would be providing, and not limiting their attacks inside Ukrainian territory itself, but not allowing them to attack Russian territories. So those are the few big takeaways for me from these three summits.
All right, interesting. Anushka, anything different that you had?
Right. So I think on the SCO summit takeaways, I'll just have to say that I wouldn't exactly put it as India losing interest in engaging with the SCO, but rather as India finding utility in the platform to kind of block moves or agreements in joint communiques that essentially hinder Indian interests. And so, in that sense, I wouldn't look at Modi's absence as disengagement or disinterest in the platform, because like I just said, it still holds a lot of value and utility for India to have a platform where it can continue to talk about its interests, especially at a platform where many of its challenging relationships are at play with, especially with Pakistan and China. But I would say that there could be a bunch of reasons why this Modi didn't choose to visit. And I think one that I would like to believe is that it's kind of like a snub to Xi Jinping for skipping on the G20 last year. And at the same time, I think it was also good in the sense that Modi didn't have to end up hearing Shehbaz Sharif's indirect remarks at how India is actually the state sponsor of terrorism and not vice versa. So some goods and some maybe speculative takeaways at my end. But I think the more interesting bit of the SCO summit was the meeting between Wang Yi and Jay Shankar on the sidelines in Astana. And maybe we can get into that later on the podcast. On NATO, I think, yeah, I also broadly agree that there were some interesting things discussed regarding provisions to Ukraine. And I think what was most important for me to take away from various reports and even their joint statement was that NATO is taking defense planning extremely seriously now. They mention in the joint statement that some states will absolutely be required to commit more than 2% of their GDP, because what we're doing is simply not enough. And acknowledging that Russia has become the reason why Euro-Atlantic security and global stability is completely shattered also means that this upped sentiment of or enhanced sentiment of preparedness means something, right? They also talk about China in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war and call it a decisive enabler of the war. And then they also talk about countermeasures they want to take against Chinese cyber attacks. And this is all in context of China conducting joint military exercises with Belarus and on the Poland border and near the Poland border. And that kind of then translates into the joint statement committing to placement of ICBMs on that flank, on that border. And so we see that the statement seems to think like it's very firmly reacting to some of what is happening vis-a-vis Russia and China. The dynamic becomes more volatile with that.
All right. So interesting. I want to go again through each of these one by one. The idea of I found the Astana declaration at the SCO, and we'll begin with the SCO. And this time the SCO came up with much more rhetoric than it has in the past, right? There were a couple of different statements that it came out, right? There was obviously the Astana declaration. Then there was this new SCO initiative on one world unity for just peace, harmony, and development. It's a mouthful. There was this thing on good neighborliness and friendliness, trust and partnership. That was another statement that they came up with. And then, of course, there was the Astana declaration, a lot of which is essentially repetitive to what happens in the past. I think one of the bits from that statement on good neighborliness I found really funny, because it says, and I'm quoting, that member states should insist on peaceful resolution of possible disputes. Member states do not discuss bilateral disputes in SCO meetings. I think this has something to do with Shehbaz Sharif and India, and the frictions that China is probably frustrated with. But Anushka, I want to come to you first. I tend to sort of agree with Amit that I think from an Indian perspective, the relevance of SCO seems to have declined, or at least its interest in engaging with the institution seems to have declined. I'm at a theoretical level, I can see why India wants to be in the organization. It's related to continental security. It's where dialogues are happening around terrorism, around Afghanistan. You also want to be on the table when some of this conversation is happening. But I don't think we are necessarily even on the table, because I remember, SEO had this sideline group of foreign ministers discussing Afghanistan, on which India was not invited. So what is the utility of this grouping to Indian foreign policy, apart from potentially annoying the United States?
I think even if annoying the United States is a utility of the grouping, India wouldn't want part in it, right? But I think from my perspective, it would be very hard to make the claim that yes, because precisely because of the dialogue that will happen at the organization, or because of the fact that India will get to share a stage with Pakistan, China, and Russia all together, when cannot do that in any other platform whatsoever. It will really lead to significant, meaningful outcomes in bilateral diplomatic relations with any of them. But yeah, like I said, the primary utility that I see here is that just like Chinese representatives came to the G20 summit and said that we have a problem with the word digital public infrastructure, we can go there and say we have a problem with the word one family, one future, or common shared destiny for one mankind, right? Or so on, something of the sort. So I think in that sense, what we can get out of it, and as you rightly indicated, it doesn't need Modi to go there, but it kind of gives us this opportunity to say that okay, this is a consensus based platform, and whatever meaningful outcomes, deliverables come from this, India has had a stake in the deliberations as much as anybody else has. And of course, precisely because of this obstacle that bilateral issues, the platform doesn't really enjoy discussing bilateral issues or does not make space for it, is the reason why their anti-terrorism grouping, right, RATS, is so dysfunctional, right? Because there can be no meaningful negotiation or outcome from that at all. And so the things that would really matter to us diplomatically, from the get-go, we knew the SCO cannot achieve that. But at the same time, what we can get out of it is put forward our interests on just another platform, but with a more diverse and more challenging representation, and at the same time stay ambivalent to ideas surrounding anti-Westernism or the grouping being a counterweight to NATO, so on and so forth, all the while not ceding space to China, so that yet another organization becomes one which is China led and China centered. So I think that's one of my concerns with India backing down from the RCEP as well, which is that you've ceded the space to China to dictate the economic architecture, or maybe massively influence the economic architecture. And so it makes sense that India plays its part in influencing documents or the outcomes of the SCO however it can, because the stakeholders are meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, I do get the sense that as much as, you know, rationally, I think and I feel that there is not much substance to be gained out of it. I don't know, maybe it's just FOMO, but I also feel the need that we need to be at that table, because, like, for example, if you're talking about UN reform and you've got a bunch of countries, you can carry them and you're on that table. So, I mean, yes, I can see obliquely, but then again, at the end of the day, in all of this, one has to weigh what the damage being on that table does to not being on the table. And perhaps so far the damage is not as significant. If we enter into a new Cold War, then maybe, there are things that we might need to reconsider. To which I want to come to you, Amit, and I want to talk to you about not the SEO, but about Modi's visit to Russia and talking about the Cold War. Obviously the Americans were very unhappy with this visit. And in the Washington Post, there's a quote by the US ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, where he basically says about the visit and the optics of Prime Minister Modi hugging Vladimir Putin, saying that I'll have to fight a lot of defensive battles trying to help this relationship ahead. I respect that India likes its strategic autonomy, but in times of conflict, there is no such thing as strategic autonomy. How seriously should one take this seeming outrage that is coming from DC? And what does India gain by this visit at this point of time?
To begin with, even I'm still skeptic if Modi should have chosen Russia to as a destination for his first state visit. I'm still not sure. I mean, this could have been avoided, right? But India-Russia relationship has been a traditional one, and has always been a sort of a thorn in India-US relations, but largely it has come into question under greatest scrutiny in the last few years is because of three reasons, right? That the first being, of course, the China-Russia deepening strategic alignment and etc., which in fact complicates India's position, India's relationship with Russia. Besides from keeping aside US's concern, it makes it complicated, right? Second is India's growing proximity with the US, and if we are in a situation and if we see our future in a way that where US or the US led West becomes a major economic partner, what value do we derive from our relationship with Russia? And if it's a question of choosing sides, which side do we go? And does it make sense to alienate to an extent the US led West, which has more, who are a greater stakeholder in India's developmental path? Third is, of course, the fact that what we're discussing before this podcast is the threat that the US-led West or the NATO views vis-a-vis Russia, right? Russia is a huge threat for them, and necessarily do not appreciate how big a threat it is to them. And this has complicated India's relationship with Russia and has brought it under greater scrutiny. The problem for India is that it is in some sort of a dilemma, in the sense that so it has two options, right? Given the current context, it can either align more and more closely with the US and alienating Russia, which is one option. The second option is that you continue to develop and cultivate your relationship with Russians, so that you avoid a situation where you have both China and Russia concerted policy or approach towards India. So this is a difficult dilemma to achieve, but and India is trying to make the most of it, right? Aligning with the US, but also maintaining some sort of a relationship with the Russians, so that India does not acquire greater salience in China-Russia relationship, and it has managed to do so till now. But the worry for me as an Indian is that the space is fast shrinking. Given the state of developments, it is highly likely that India will have to make a choice going ahead if Russia-Ukraine war prolongs further, and US's position becomes even more stringent with respect to India's relationship with the Russians. It might become difficult for India to maintain this sort of a balance. Now, I was reading one of the statement by a former aide or advisor to the Trump presidency, right? And he said that we need to reevaluate and reassess our relationship with India because we're not getting anything on the India-Russia front. But there was another statement by, I think, Lisa Curtis, who said that India is far too important a partner in US's attempt to counter China, for India-Russia relationship to be a factor in India-US relationship. So I mean, there's a sense of understanding even within the US administration and the US policymakers. But again, it's a tough choice, and it's not something that Indians themselves do not realize. They realize that their relationship with Russia is becoming increasingly problematic. It's just a question of to what extent can they maintain this relationship and reaching to a point wherein they have to make a final choice.
Yeah, it's really tricky, right? Because, I mean, the more you read from what's coming, I'm the first thing I take your point completely that, that there is, I think there is not sufficient appreciation within India, just like, often we accuse the US and the West of not sufficiently appreciating India's concerns vis-a-vis China. I think that there isn't sufficient appreciation. Perhaps it is at the government level, but at least in the public discourse level, there isn't sufficient appreciation of the nature of threat that they see Russia as being, right? I mean, the NATO statement is quite categorical about that, where they call Russia the most significant and direct threat to their security, which is very different from, say, how they talk about China, particularly in that communique also. China is seen as a pacing challenge in the US's mind. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that the effort that the US and the West has engaged in over the last 2.5 years since the war began is to try and isolate Russia, whether it's economically, militarily, it's essentially to try and isolate and strangle, which in itself is a problem for Indian foreign policy. Because India would see an isolated Russia as adversely affecting its interests, because an isolated Russia potentially leans far more on China. And given India's dependence on military supplies from Russia in particular, it sort of, and also Russia's potential to provide more energy supplies to China, it becomes sort of a valve that allows China to ease pressure in many ways, right? So it's tricky. It's not in India's interest to see Russia isolated, whereas it is Western policy to get Russia isolated, right? So you're going to see this friction continue to play out. But, my final point on this is that, again, I'm referring to that Washington Post story, and we link the story in the show notes. A lot of the comments that you hear from, and the message that you take away from the story is that the unease in the US was around the optics of the visit at the same time as the NATO summit. It wasn't necessarily about substantive issues. In fact, if you see on substantive issues, for example, energy trade, you've seen India and the US actually engage to the point where Eric Garcetti earlier this year was talking about how the US was, actively working with India when it came to Russian oil deliveries and things like that, right? It was engaged with India on that issue. So I'm a little sort of, I find it a little bit strange that the timing of the visit, if even that could have been different, it might have not created such a furor. But yes, Anushka, I can see you raising your hand. Please go ahead.
Right. I just want to make one sweeping claim that I think could be very interesting to make in this context. And this is purely based on the India Russia summit joint statement that the MEA published. Two of the things that I see there remind the exact context in which the Russia China relationship is building, which is one, setting high targets for trade. So we saw a couple years ago that Russia and China set a target of reaching 100 billion trade by maybe 2022. And now we see that same target set between India and Russia for 2025, I think, or maybe the year isn't specified, but that's a target. Similarly, we see that both sides say something like we should explore all possible avenues of cooperation, including political, strategic, military, security, trade, investment, energy, so on and so forth. And the relationship should be multifaceted and mutually beneficial. Now, I'm not saying this is No Limits Partnership 2.0, but it's very interesting that they are indeed saying that nothing is off the table, even if it means implicitly some things would be, right? But given that India and Russia have a robust military partnership, I don't see why anything else is off the table, right? And so it gives me a sense that India is, like Manoj, you said, invested in continuing to enhance ties with Russia to whatever degree possible because it is in our interest. And aside from the optics, I think the US, Eric Garcetti's statements also tell us that the US is doing its best to play down the summit and not assign any meaningful value to it, which could mean either they really don't see any value in it, or in that there is some tension that something meaningful has come out of the summit, right? Because he says something like, we read joint statements and we assess them, and we can tell from a joint statement whether it has been written down or it has, some meaningful value attached to it. Now, Eric Garcetti doesn't mention India and Russia, but that's the only joint summit that was in deliberation during his remarks. And the other thing he also says is that, we say in the US that if a prime minister's visit ends with 5 or 10 deliverables, it's a great sign. And at our peak, India and US have had 173 deliverables. So this means nothing, right? But perhaps I think his most interesting statement is that, India-US relations are not deep enough to be taken for granted, which is diametrically opposed to the point maybe Amit was referring to, which Lisa Curtis made, right? That India and US are such important partners, especially in the context of countering China. And so I would say that beyond the optics, I think not only did the India-Russia summit achieve, at least symbolically, it proved some evidence that both sides are vested in an enhanced relationship, but at the same time, it also did worry the US.
Okay, Amit, you have your hand up, but I'm going to, before I come to you, Amit, I'm just going to make a point. I don't necessarily think that those two arguments by Lisa Curtis and Eric Garcetti are necessarily opposing each other. I think your relationship can be not deep enough to survive certain frictions, but also be significant enough to only deal with China, which is actually a problem because it's not deep enough. It's got one external factor which is predominant. Amit, I turn to you.
Yeah, I agree that there's this sense in Indian strategic and policy making circles that this is India displaying strategic autonomy. But I just have to point out, and it'll be very brief, that strategic autonomy should be subservient to national interest and not the other way around. And I think we should not test the limits of India-US relationship and with our deep relationship with the Russians. I mean, there are far more greater benefits when it comes to our relationship with the West and the US, and should not be testing the limits in that sense.
I have two more, one brief intervention and one question for both of you, which we can perhaps address very briefly on Russia before we move to the NATO summit. There's an interesting piece by Constantino Xavier and Lucas Daly from CSEP, where they talk about the fact that, often we look at the India-Russia relationship only in the context of the bilateral relationship and the West, and, arms trade and oil trade, increasingly oil and gas trade, energy trade. They give us 3 points of how the relationship also has implications for broader South Asia and how they're actually engaging in South Asia. So the 3 points that they make are, firstly, that there is political cooperation between the two of them when it comes to countering Western values-based interventionism, economic sanctions, and other forms of coercion. And they give an example of Bangladesh in this regard. The second dimension they talk about is India-Russia convergence on financial and technical assistance to facilitate South Asia's energy transition. In this, again, they talk about an example of joint support for a nuclear power plant in Bangladesh. And the third thing that they talk about is offering development solutions and infrastructure investment to countries in the region. And one of the examples that they talk about is the Rajapaksa International Airport in Hambantota. They talk about India and Russian sort of capital looking at collaborating in that regard. So there are different dimensions to the relationship, which might not be necessarily as strategically significant, but which are emerging, which we've not necessarily looked at when we discuss this relationship. My other question to you is, again, my last question on what Putin's been doing is that a week before all of this, President Putin was in East Asia. He went to Vietnam and he went to North Korea. Obviously, one of the big headlines from the visit was this mutual defense agreement with the North Koreans. I've written about this, and we understand how the Chinese might not necessarily be terribly happy about this agreement. And for obvious reasons, it encroaches on their sphere of influence, and how one enterprising Bloomberg journalist asked the foreign ministry that if you are uncomfortable with Cold War alignments in the Indo-Pacific like NATO, then why would you be happy with this Cold War pact being revived? How does India view this? And I don't think I remember seeing an official statement of any kind from India, but is this agreement of mutual defense between North Korea and Russia something that furthers India's interests or impacts them adversely? Perhaps, Amit, you can start.
The first implication that I can think of is only the fact that it will destabilize the South China Sea and the East China Sea in that regard, and again, that part of the world is already volatile because of the cross-strait tensions and other things, and the fact that it might bring NATO in Asia Pacific, something which China has been complaining about, and even we saw with the NATO summit, right? They said that don't poke your don't get NATO in Asia Pacific and stay away from Asia Pacific. That was a message that the Chinese had for that. In that regard, I think if it increases China's insecurity vis-a-vis NATO, I think it's something which is good for India. If it and that would also mean that China would have to divert more resources in that area than it already is. Right. Second is it might also because you're talking about Indian interest and it's relative and how it impacts your adversaries, you'll have to take that into account. Another way Chinese might not be happy with is the fact that Russians and North Koreans have a mutual defense treaty now between them, and then again it changes power equations in that region. And as you said, China is not particularly happy, and I don't yet see a direct impact on India's interest insofar, apart from nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the concerns around global proliferation, nuclear proliferation. But in any sense, if it impacts or negatively impacts China's interest in those regions, which might make it invest more or give more attention to that region, I think it should, on relative terms, it should help India. And NATO coming in the area is, the more insecurity it creates for China, the good for us.
So yeah, okay. So your argument is in a nutshell that the more it troubles Beijing, the better it is for us.
Yes.
Okay, Anushka, do you agree with that or do you differ with that to some degree?
I would have to differ with that because I think the most interesting bit of the Russia-North Korea Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, which they've called it the 2024 treaty, is that in two of its articles, it not only affirms that the two sides can come to each other's aid and defense in case of conflict, it also affirms that Russia will continue to enhance quote unquote military technical partnership with the North Koreans. And in one of their clarification notes that the Russian Council or the parliament publishes, they say that one might perceive that this is Russia violating the UN sanctions on DPRK by actually allowing for imports of military components from North Korea. But that's not what it actually is. And our position has been clear. While we don't violate the sanctions, what is not prohibited is permitted. So it basically speaks to Russia not only kind of affirming that, the two sides are good on enhancing military cooperation as much as possible, even if it means undermining or finding loopholes in the UN sanctions regime some way. It means that Russia is okay supporting the North Korean nuclear industrial setup. And there are some provisions on non-traditional aspects of partnership as well, like health and education. So Russia wants to help North Korea out with making these provisions for its population. So it kind of makes the case that Russia is okay with North Korea as it is, and the partnership is most likely to go up and up from here. And so how I think this impacts India is that because India still vehemently supports a UN-centered, maybe multilateral order, and India has had to face this dilemma of balancing between both Russia as a partner and the West as a partner. Russia's engagement with this axis that's come about, right? China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia, this axis means that it only becomes tougher for India to defend Russian actions or to continue to kind of say that Russia is a great friend and a historical ally when, Putin would go ahead and do something like this. So it not just questions India's firm commitment to maybe the UN-centered order, it reflects poorly when India is unable to balance between this purely anti-West foundational axis and the West itself. And because India has prided itself so much on being this bridge and this balancer between other entities in the West, Global South is being one example. It becomes hard, right? But at the same time, I think hypocrisy is a consistent feature of geopolitics, and that's precisely how I think India plans to play this, which is why we have no governmental statements. And if we were to see maybe a journalist asking somebody from the Indian policy setup, okay, what do you think of the Russia DPRK relationship? They're going to say exactly what the Chinese foreign ministry said. And this is again speculative, but my opinion on this, which is that it's a bilateral issue, it's a sovereign issue, we have nothing to do with it, and Russia is free to do whatever it wants, and it doesn't matter to us what they do, as long as their camp or their bloc, if one gets formed, impacts us directly.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to lean. I don't know. I don't know if I tend to lean more on what Anushka is saying, but I agree with both of what you're saying. Yes, it does. I think it does complicate China's calculus, but it also, I think it's fundamentally problematic from an Indian point of view. The more I think about it, Anushka talked about India trying to be a bridge. Increasingly, the way the world is turning out to be, we might end up being a bridge to nowhere, and that I think is a problem. I think that on many levels, I don't think it is necessarily in India's interests for NATO to become militarily deeply engaged in the Indo-Pacific, because we don't necessarily want conflict in the region. It adversely affects our own developmental outcomes in many ways. Do we want China's actions to be constrained and China to be better behaved and so on and so forth? Yes, but increasingly conflict sort of laden situation can be problematic. It is also deeply concerning that the Russians had to sign this agreement with the North Koreans, and explicitly, like Anushka mentioned, looking at military technological support and things like that, given how much we are dependent on Russian military supplies. So, it reminds me of an old joke from a Govinda movie where, Govinda steps up onto the railway station and a really old porter asks him that, can I pick up your luggage? And Govinda tells him, you will pick up our luggage, but then who will pick you up? So it's something sort of like that, where you end up in that situation. Kudos to my 90s Bollywood knowledge. But okay, so that's your sort of lay of the land. So I think that it's fundamentally problematic for India that this agreement has been signed. Also, given the historical sort of links of leakage of nuclear technology to North Korea and missile from North Korea to Pakistan and missile technology from North Korea to Pakistan, again, it instinctively this makes me uncomfortable from an Indian interest perspective. As much as it might make Beijing also uncomfortable, I think India would also be. I don't think we'd be happy about this prospect. But okay, with that, let's move from one Cold War treaty alignment to probably the Cold War treaty alignment that still matters, which is NATO. We just had the big summit in DC. A lot of the news cycle, because it's political season, it's election season in the US, will focus on Biden's gaffes and his so-called quote-unquote big boy press conference. I found that phrase very funny. But yeah, but that, I think a lot of the focus, but substantively, and we've talked about this a little bit already, where Amit mentioned the 40 billion euro commitment and things like that. But what are your big takeaways, particularly from Indo-Pacific point of view? And do you think, again, this is a very difficult question, but do you think this document that has been issued holds any relevance come November if we see a Trump presidency come into play? So perhaps, Anushka, you can go with that. Easy question for you.
Absolutely easy to answer. I would say, and my easy answer is basically rubbing my hands off, which is that one absolutely cannot predict the vagaries that will come with the Trump presidency. And this is purely going on precedents. But I would say, at least in terms of defense spending, which I think I talked about at the very start as being one of my significant takeaways from the NATO document, both Biden and Trump will want the same goals there, but they will try and enforce it in different manners. So while the Biden-led administration's participation in the recent NATO summit has kind of tried to frame it in a way that, global and regional security environment is absolutely shattered and we have these huge challenges vis-a-vis Russia and China. And so we absolutely need to commit this 2% or more if we want stability and security for all of ourselves. But Trump's approach to this would be that, the US will back out if you don't commit 2% because, oh, you're not equally vested in this as we are. And so that emotive versus the transactional nature is what, in my opinion, might differ. But the end goal will remain the same, which would be to continue to invest in NATO's defense planning architecture and make it rounded. And at the same time, I think one of the misperceptions, say, with Trump has also been that he's not that vested in security alliances or partnership traditionally from the US's perspective. Now, I would say that has proved indeed true in Japan's case, where and from the Obama to the Trump administration, the number of troops deployed, say, maybe in some of US's bases in Japan, we've seen that number of troops decline. But in Taiwan's case, Trump presidency has seen the most, like the highest valued deliverables for military and security related purposes to Taiwan than we have in even the Biden presidency or the two Obama presidencies, right? So I think in that sense, if priorities remain clear, we might see a similar emphasis under Trump as well. But as to the value of the document and whether Trump will continue to perceive Russia as a challenger, or will he totally reverse the stance and say that Putin is a great man and, I've met him personally and I think, he has the right to do whatever he wants, is something that I really can't speak to. But as to the value of the document, there are some end goals that will absolutely remain the same because it means for US and its allies to be vested in the same goals. And the direction may change from Russia to China. Yeah.
Amit, are you as optimistic as Anushka?
See, I'm sure if Trump comes to power, there'll be greater insecurity, especially the way that, as Anushka was mentioning, under Trump's previous presidency, the transatlantic partnerships and alliance had come under great stress. Even their partnership with the Asia Pacific countries or the Indo Pacific countries had come under some stress because Trump's policies are largely directed towards its domestic audience, and that might impact their foreign policy and external policies to an extent. But then again, in terms of rhetoric, it might create some frictions. But when it comes to implementation of these policies, I would like to believe there would be greater policy consistency and continuance in that regard. But of course, you'll find greater rhetorics, a large number of rhetorics and statements which would try to bring down these kind of alliances and partnerships, and it would nudge the other European NATO members to contribute more to this security architecture. But in terms of implementation, I think greater policy continuance.
Okay, I'm not as sanguine as either of you. I think that there are serious challenges for NATO if you see a Donald Trump presidency. There's already been lots of talk among former Trump officials, but also, folks within that ambit. Some of it is challenging from an Indian perspective because it talks about this sort of, in some ways, authoritarian sort of sphere of influence logic. But at the same time, some of it makes sense. So folks like Elbridge Colby and all who make the argument that, look, Russia is not your primary challenge. Your primary challenge is China. Whereas we just talked earlier about how NATO looks at Russia as the primary challenge. And therefore, if you need to really deal with China, you need to focus your force presence and all. That in itself comes with challenges for India. But yeah, I'm not as sanguine that, yes, NATO has expanded, certain structural changes have taken place. It's not easy to unwind some of those, but you might end up seeing some sort of a deal with the Russians. And it's also partly because you're also seeing changes in European politics, right? France just went through a very, very interesting election. Britain's seen a change in government. So you're seeing shifts in politics in Europe also. So I'm not necessarily as sanguine that a Trump presidency would mean fair amount of policy consistency. But then again, that's easy for me to say because I don't have to take a position on it. So yeah. So my sort of final question to both of you is in the context of this last 10 days of Indian diplomacy, the one thing that we did not touch on was the India-China relationship in specific. And we had a meeting between Jaishankar and Wang Yi in Astana. Both the sides issued a readout. This was the first meeting at this level since the elections in India. Are you optimistic of some sort of a breakthrough and return to normalcy, or is it still, a long way to go?
I think some people have pointed to optimism, given that China recently also appointed its ambassador to India, right? And the fact that both the foreign minister, Wang Yi and Jaishankar have said that peace and tranquility at the boundary is something which is desirable. People have interpreted it in various ways, but this has been a position of course, India has taken, but there's nothing new with the Chinese position either, right? They have been saying that peace and tranquility at LAC is something which is desirable, but again, on their terms, right? And I don't think any meaningful, substantial gain that they have derived so far from this standoff, if there was one dedicated or demarcated gain that they wanted to derive out of this situation, and I don't see that they have managed to do so. And I don't think any meaningful change has happened so far between the two countries. And so I'm very skeptic. I'm very pessimistic that this will lead to any change in the current setup. And this might be little more prolonged than we would imagine.
Okay, Anushka, it's up to you to bring back the optimism.
Well, as delightful that responsibility is, I don't think I'm just ready to take it up because and we've been referencing 20th century movies. So in the context of Xu Fenghong's appointment as India's ambassador, he's been doing some really fun things. And one of the things he recently did reminded me of another 20th century or 1946 movie called Dr. Kotnis Ki Amar Katha, or something of the sort, where he recently organized an event where Dr. Kotnis's historic military aid to China was acknowledged, and somebody at the meeting said something like, and Chu Fei-hong retweeted that, saying that Dr. Kotnis would have wanted India and China to coexist and have absolutely excellent relations, but to disappoint both the ambassador and Dr. Kotnis, I don't think from the Wang Yi and Jaishankar meeting we have gotten to that point yet, because there were some really interesting things said in the joint statements on or the communiques on both sides, and there are clearly differences, right? Despite deliberations through the core commander level talks, or despite China's inclusion of maybe Depsang and Demchok and as issues in the last few core commander level talks, we don't really see either of the side saying anything in the aftermath of this meeting that indicates that they are ready to accommodate each other. Or from the Indian perspective, China is ready to make any concessions on the border, right? Because on the Indian side, the MEA readout says that the two ministers agreed that prolongation of the current situation in the border areas is not in interest of either side. And, if it was really true that the two ministers agreed to this, it would mean that the Chinese are willing to stray slightly away from their stance where they say that, there's no issue on the border at all. But as per their readout, they only say that there is a need for the two sides to properly handle the border situation while actively resuming normal exchanges. And so their main goal is to have political dialogue resume and economic interface resume, because it has impacts for their businesses and their tourists and their journalists in India. But none of this means that they have to engage in complete disengagement, unlike what the MEA readout suggests and wanted, right? Similarly, trust, which is again a very interesting thing in the relationship, is that India, I think, should be clear by now that China is not going to respect any bilateral agreements, no matter their legal or political weight or implications. And so even though Jaishankar reportedly reiterated their value, his emphasis in the three mutuals was not on mutual trust, but on mutual respect, mutual sensitivity, and mutual interests. But Wang Yi said that the two sides need to trust each other. And even though trust is a Chinese side as well, because they think everything India does is because it's a pawn of the US. And so in this regard, I think there continue to be significant differences. Nothing that the Chinese said indicates that there's going to be any concessions or normalcy on the border. And nothing that the Indian statement said seems like something the Chinese would have agreed to.
Okay. So clearly we have no optimism. Folks, if you're looking for optimism on the India-China front, I won't give you my view here, but I will link in the show notes a recent piece that I did for the Indian Express along with Vanshika Saraf, which talks about the two joint statements where we express a hint of optimism following this meeting. So, if you're looking for a little bit of that, you can look over there. But we also, of course, are very, very keen to hear your views on the relationship. And for that, we have a new survey called the China Challenge Survey, which we will be sharing in the show notes here. Please take that survey. It's really, really useful to understand and gather accurate information about how Indians think about the relationship. Public opinion is critical to policy formulation. And if you look at the survey and if you start taking those 10 questions, which will take you less than 3 minutes, and you feel like, wow, these are really tricky and I cannot answer them, can I recommend you to actually take a look at Takshashila's education offerings, particularly the DNFA offering, which will equip you with intricate knowledge of strategic studies. Then surveys like these will then be a piece of cake. But if defense and foreign affairs is not your cup of tea, you can look at other offerings from the advanced public policy course to the technology policy course, and even our brief expert capsule courses, which range from space to life sciences to China studies and a whole lot more. So you can log on to the Takshashila website for all this and more. Amit and Anushka, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Manoj, for having us.
And again, to another fun week or 10 days in Indian diplomacy. Hopefully, we can do this again when we have another cluster of events. Thank you so much all for listening. If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.